Okay, good afternoon. As Megan said, my name is Raimone Roberts. And so in staying with the theme of connectivity, you may see transformational entrepreneurship and you may kind of wonder, well, how is this connectivity? But if you give me a moment to kind of redefine some things for us through a few stories, we can see how entrepreneurship business can be one of the greatest vehicles that we can have for connectivity. Now, with any good business presentation, you have to have a quote from Harvard Business Review. So, with that said, in a recent issue of the Harvard Business Review, they gave us a definition for transformational entrepreneurship: creating innovative solutions to the world's biggest problems that are scalable, sustainable, and systematic. Now, there's three words I have kind of highlighted there in this definition that I'll get to a little bit later. Now, when we hear this, we normally think of folks like this. We think of men and women who have large companies who've done great things, especially when you talk about sustainable and systematic world solutions, kind of a global effect. I have billions of dollars at my disposal. And we think, well, if I had all that, well, sure, I could do something transformational. But my question, my challenge to us today is, do we need all those resources? Could we, in fact, have exactly what we need right in front of us? Could we have around us what we need to be a transformational entrepreneur? Now, when we think of this term entrepreneur, sometimes we may think we have to have a degree, we may have to have a certain background, or maybe we have to have a certain kind of business sense. Maybe there's just this intuition that you have where you see something and you think, I know how to make that $1 million idea. Well, again, if we can kind of back out of that particular definition, an entrepreneur basically is someone who sees a problem and finds a solution. So if that's our definition, journey with me, if you will, to a place that I guarantee no one has ever heard of before, called Toccoa, Georgia. Now, unless you're from Toccoa, you've heard of Toccoa, but if you're not, then you probably haven't, okay? But now, what's so interesting about this town, it's a small, sleepy town, if you will, in the northern part of Georgia, that you can see there, just about an hour and a half drive outside of Atlanta. So these are some modern day pictures, but I want to take us back to the 1920s and 1930s, where this town, much like the rest of the nation, in particular the South, had an issue. And it was this issue of race. And it was this issue of blacks and whites being separated based on one thing: they look different from one another. And so many of us know the story, and oftentimes when this story, this part of our history as a nation is brought up, it's usually with this thought process of, it's almost like this negative thing we don't really want to talk about, and we're glad we've moved forward. However, again, if we could back out of that, and sometimes our greatest challenges, sometimes our darkest parts of our past can be some of the greatest stories of hope, success, and vision for our future. So my first story begins with this sign. And it's this idea of blacks and whites having these separate kind of lifestyles, if you will. In Toccoa, there was train tracks that went down the center of the city. Whites on one side, blacks on the other. And so with that went the rest of the town. However, there was one man who thought a little bit differently than everyone else. His name was Ike Gilliard. And the thing about Ike, in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, he had a restaurant. And in this restaurant, it was a little bit different than the rest of the town. Because in his restaurants, whites and blacks ate together. Although they were separated, the whites ate in the back, and the blacks ate in the front. Now today we may think, well, it's not that big a deal. But for in that time period, that was a huge statement. Now, one of my first questions would be, why, if there's such cultural norms, why would whites sit in the back and blacks sit in the front? Why would they embrace such an experience like that? Where even Ike's family members, who were part of the staff at the restaurant, did not even feel comfortable with this situation because of the tensions, the racial tensions in this town. But see, I would submit to you, Ike Gilliard was just one of these transformational entrepreneurs. Because sometimes what you find in business is that the service, the product, transcends cultural barriers. And as this family would sometimes say, when the food is really that good, no one cares about the color, no one cares where they sit, as long as they get a good meal. And so when you have someone like Ike Gilliard who's all of a sudden breaking cultural norms, it begins to have ripple effects. So let's step out of Toccoa for a moment. John Mackey, co-CEO and founder of Whole Foods, he has a recent book called Conscious Capitalism. And what's so interesting about this book is that although he doesn't maybe use the word transformational entrepreneur, he talks about how business can have this positive impact on our culture and our community. And more importantly, those entrepreneurs, those business owners that are intentional about doing that. So a quick quote here: business is good because it creates value. It's ethical because it's based on voluntary exchange. It's noble because it can elevate our existence. And it's heroic because it lifts people out of poverty and creates prosperity, elevating us out of our existence. Now, what's so interesting about that thought process is that do we ever think that maybe an entrepreneur can come up with a business idea and elevate us out of our experience? Now, this next story, this isn't the general store. Try to get pictures because we're talking the 50s and 60s realm. It was a little bit hard to, but picture this in your mind, very simple general store. And then we take Ike Gilliard's son-in-law, Leroy Roberts. And Leroy had a general store. Now, what was unique about Leroy's general store only a couple decades later was it was the only place in this small town where blacks and whites shopped together. Now, I would kind of put the thought out, where do you think Leroy got the audacity to think that he could shift the cultural norm? Now, Leroy and Ike, they weren't these college educated coming from these well-to-do families. They were black men who had just been recently, their grandparents, possibly even their parents, knew slavery and knew it well. But yet, they have transcended so much. Here they are doing things that no one else was able to do. And what's so interesting about Leroy's story is that as this phenomena began to happen, where blacks and whites are shopping together, it began to have a ripple effect in the rest of the community. Because what began to happen in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we began to have integration within our nation. And as we all know from from our history books, and some of us in the room, even from our own experiences, it was a tense time in our nation. So what began to happen in this small town, white mayors began to come to Leroy and say, what you have in your store, we want in our community. One man all of a sudden affecting his entire region, his entire community. When we talk about transformational entrepreneurship, it's this type of thought process to say, do we really have to have things the way they are? Can we find a creative way to bring a solution to a problem that so many people are having a hard time figuring out? I mean, if we think back to that time period, there were so many challenges with this thing called integration. And all of these stories are based on the racial challenge that we had back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. This point that we're discussing today, this idea, isn't regulated to race. It's not really regulated to anything but, do we have a problem? Can we use business? Can we use this idea of entrepreneurship to create a solution? Now, both these men had to take risk, but their risk produced hope. I mean, think about this. If you're a small town, having to integrate, having to tackle cultural challenges that have been there for generations, and here you are, civic leadership, trying to find solutions. And you have an entrepreneur who not only has a solution via he can talk about it, he's doing it. And as the story later on goes, the police would come and pick up Leroy at his house, and he would go with them on ride-alongs to break up racial fights, where the police officers would work with the whites, Leroy would work with the blacks. So all of a sudden, you have a man who just had a general store, now he's a part of something greater, something bigger. Attacking this problem that there were very few solutions to. When as entrepreneurs, when as individuals, we begin to take these risks, the ripple effects of hope, well, they become endless. And it's like taking a journey to where your destination is unknown, but yet you know you're going to go where no one's been before. And can we believe today that there are, even with the problems that we're faced with, the challenges that we have, let's not talk on a global level like a Tom Shoes that has done a phenomenal job of creating this idea of business, having this nonprofit effect, if you will, having this social cause, if you will. But let's take it on a smaller scale. What I like to call the lemonade stand effect. What do we have in front of us? What can we teach our children? What can we teach the next generation? Can we teach them that inside of you, around you, your own ideas are creative enough to come up with solutions for the largest and even smallest of problems? This is what I think embodies transformational entrepreneurship, because it can be any one of us. It doesn't take an extensive resume. It doesn't take certain degrees. All it takes is believing that we can make a difference. Was risk involved? Absolutely. Could we fail? Absolutely. But if we can believe that failure isn't the end, but it's only a stepping stone to something greater that we would have never had if we hadn't tried. I mean, if Leroy Roberts had stepped back and said, well, what if I'm not successful? Maybe I shouldn't open the store. Because it's still in the midst of racial tension, so all my suppliers are white. Who knows if they think of me as a black business owner? Maybe I shouldn't do this. Maybe the risk is too great. But as I stand here and tell you this story today, if my grandfather hadn't taken that risk, then my uncle wouldn't have been a Tuskegee Airman who were part of the first black pilots in World War II and the Korean War. My dad's second oldest brother wouldn't have been the deputy mayor of Denver, Colorado, because he wouldn't have believed that he could have started a construction company, and for 20 or so years, it would have been successful. And through his success in the community, it would have elevated him to a prominent point to where he could begin to influence the community and the city he lived in. Or my aunt, my dad's younger sister, who lives in Atlanta, Georgia, who's now an entrepreneur, who works with women coming out of battered and abused homes, who works with women coming out of jail to help them redefine their life and give them purpose and hope, helping them to be entrepreneurs so they can then find ways to solve their own problems and provide solutions for themselves and others. The ripple effects are endless. And so I challenge us today. It's not necessarily we need to all go out and start businesses, although that may be a byproduct. But the challenge is that we can all take a risk in an area that we know there's a problem. Going back to the lemonade stand effect, what is it like to tell a little kid, if there's someone you don't connect with in your neighborhood, if there's someone that maybe you don't get along with in your school, how about you guys just sell something together? Nothing brings us together like working together to make a little cash, right? But if we have the right intentions involved, what we see in this picture here, where you have little kids from all walks of life, if they can figure it out, if Leroy Roberts and Ike Gilliard can figure it out in a time period where it literally should have been impossible, why not us? Why not now? Thank you.